And we're live.
We're at it again.
Here we are. This is our kitchen table. And this is our thoughts on immunology.
This week.
Or today.
Right. This minute.
So we've been thinking a lot about the term immunocompromised, which is also immunodeficient and immunosuppressed. And hi, Cindy.
Hi,
and Cindy. And so then we've been poking at it. What does it mean? What does it look like? Who is it? What counts? Where are the thresholds? What's the definitions?
What should you do if you were responsible for these people? That's a whole other conversation. Which might be next week.
Saturday, I think, or Sunday.
Yeah, Saturday, Sunday.
Look for that one.
But it's good continuity, right?
Yeah,
There's
exactly.
a lot. This is a big topic.
Did you write on yourself?
I did. I was maybe bored in a meeting. Aubrey has clearly been indoors way too long when she starts doodling on her legs. But moving on. So Diana, why? I so love your academic bent, and this is just fabulous. It's really lovely to get to go online with you because you come so prepared that I just get to like respond. So I'm gonna take a little bit more of an interview tact with you today. So.
Okay, great. And I love the way you respond. You bring so much to bear.
Thank you. Yeah. So how would you like in this research? What did you come up with as a working definition for what is immunocompromised, and how many different terms did you come across?
Right. So many people, or lay level use of terminology is a bunch of terms that are equal. Immunocompromised, immunodeficient, immunosuppressed, or not immunocompetent.
Hey, it's like neuronormal.
Right,
yeah.
Exactly. So, in fact, they each have precise their own definitions. You know, the drug that I'm on suppresses my immune system, but the autoimmune disease I have compromises or has particular deficiencies related to it. Mm-hmm. And gosh, all this research I understand and can see evidence of it in my life in whole new ways. But overall, it's thought of as either a weakened immune system mm-hmm. or an immune system that's not functioning properly.
Right.
Which doesn't necessarily mean weakened. Mm-hmm. It can mean overactive.
Right. Yeah.
But weakened because of that.
Right. Or responsive in ways that are not standard. And so we don't get a predictable response out of an immune system when presented with a particular challenge.
Right.
Hi,
yes,
Bray.
Indeed.
Hi, Chip. So what I hear in what you just said is that there's a lot of nuance inside of all of these terms. And while it's great that we have a larger awareness that, hey, immunocompromised is a thing and we need to be accounting for it, there's a lot of different ways that it could actually be impactful in any given situation, depending on what your particular immune situation is.
Right. Which reminds me, anyone who wants to know why she's wearing a mask and I'm not, see our previous video.
It's because we don't know where I've been, technically. Well, or we don't know who.
There we are.
We're back. For it.
Okay.
There's a lot.
Look, now you're watching.
Hey. Oh. Oops. Yeah, tech is fun.
Okay, so yes, it's complicated, and it relates to why we wanted to talk about it. Because the immune system, when we don't know what it is and we're not understanding it, and it's just something we're pointing to, we think about it in these very simplistic ways. It's on or it's off. Mm-hmm. Or it's lagging and needs to be boosted.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Or it's at war. It's going to conquer. And we've discussed that before. That's not exactly how that works.
Right. So being immune compromised does not mean having like weak warriors.
Right.
It just means that the warriors may be busy fighting if we're going to use the war analogy, they might be busy already, or they might be, working without a particular resource.
Right.
Yeah. So the purpose of an immune system functioning well is to have something that's really resourced and balanced. It's not about always getting stronger per se.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. So in your research, can you tell us a little bit about how all of these different descriptions of immune compromised can manifest?
Yeah. So, mostly because what I was looking at was the popular press, all we have is a bunch of little examples, but the examples themselves are illuminating. So it might be something like you can't produce antibodies of a particular kind, or broadly. It might be that the white blood cells that are so important to cranking out a lot of the resources, that there's just not enough of them to go around. What was another example? Oh, the ability to recognize invaders. Right? Like, oh, I don't see you. I don't recognize you as being someone who shouldn't be here.
Right.
Which is the opposite of the autoimmune.
Right. It would be like, I'm resourced, but I don't have the right programming.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
So it can mean so many different things. Those are just like the little tidbits that get thrown out into the popular media to demonstrate, because it's such a complex system.
Right. Yeah. And that can become, there's a big difference between, hey, I don't have enough white blood cells and my body doesn't recognize it, and the outcomes for those two different things, which might get lumped into immunocompromised, would be hugely different for any given patient. Right.
Which is why, again, there really is no test. There's no threshold. There's no, hey, this person is a strong enough immune system, go out into the world and conquer. And if you are below this threshold, no good, you should stay home. It's just not that simple.
Right. And we've talked before about how certain conditions might give you more vulnerability in terms of a bacterial infection versus a viral infection.
Right.
And there's, honestly, we just don't have enough time or energy to research all of that, to have that, here and valid now, unfortunately. But it is a really rich opportunity for future research to occur.
Yes.
Okay, so you were mentioning that when inside of this research, you were able to pull apart quite a few different categories of who is immunocompromised. Do you want to share a little bit about that?
I do. The thing I want to say first, though, is what happens if someone is immunocompromised? Why do we care? What does it mean? What does it look like in experience? And then we'll go to the who.
Right. So
here, too, there's a bunch of different details that can be pulled apart. It might be that someone who's immunocompromised, well, let's just say me. It might be that I am more susceptible. I catch things more easily and they become a problem. It might be that once I've caught something, it lasts longer. Takes longer for my body to clear it. It might be that it gets more severe, that it escalates into something that is a bigger deal and has bigger consequences. It might be that some of the early warning signs that would get someone to go to get medical intervention or help or support aren't even seen. Like that example I was talking about a few videos ago, when I had a major infection inside my pelvis, but my white blood cell count was within the normal range, just high on normal.
Right.
Because it's not a strong enough signal that there's something going on.
Right.
And so then something can get more embedded and more entrenched before there's actually external buy-in to help you with it.
Right. And I can see that occurring on two different levels. There's both your immune system might be so occupied or so under-resourced that it doesn't have the ability to respond in a timely manner. But also, if you're dealing with a condition, you might already have so much inflammation and so much discomfort that it's almost like white noise, and it takes quite a bit more of an infection to break through the awareness.
Right. So there's the lab tests and the individuals.
Yeah, the subjective experience can also not trigger.
Exactly. And then there's the reality that sometimes if there's a weakening in an important area of the immune system, something that might escalate over a week or two for someone else escalates over a few days.
Mm-hmm.
So, which makes it even more complicated because it can go faster and it can also seem slower.
Right.
Because the early signals are missed.
Mm-hmm. You know, as you say that, I think what I can see is that even the treatment becomes much more complicated, because if you're working with someone who's autoimmune or in a condition where their immune system is on high alert, the tendency to interpret any intervention as a threat is going to be much higher inside of that system. And you're most likely you're going to be working with just a weaker system overall. And so you're going to have to actually do more intervention on top of it, likely.
So complicated.
And can make things far more dicey.
Yeah. We had a great conversation too then about, those are qualitative descriptions, but it may show up as an example, and this totally was part of my life experience. Hi, Carmen. Of chronic yeast infections. My 20s, 30s, even into my early 40s, I had yeast infections that cycled with my menses.
Wow.
I mean, it was intense. And finally I did find a way to delve into both to deal with it and deal with the overall balance of my body. It took both.
Right.
That's what it took.
Mm-hmm. And that's such a great example of another component of immune compromise, which is sometimes, like, all of us have the yeast, the yeast infection, it's an overgrowth of something that the human body absolutely needs. We won't function without candida in our system.
Right.
But we have to have a balance, which is different for every person to begin with. And then if you already have an inflammatory condition, it's just going to be much more prevalent. And that's such a great example of how things get weird when when the system is in imbalance.
That's right. And it gets even more complicated because, as I think back on this life experience, what made the final difference is I also had another major fungal overgrowth. And that one needed to be undone so that the yeast could then be undone. So that, right, but how to even translate all of that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, this is not something I've researched highly, so I'm just going to lightly mention it, but there is in the more wellness-oriented health communities, rather than allopathic Western-style medicine, there's a new theory emerging that there's actually a really intricate balance between viruses, bacteria, and fungus inside the body as a natural part of our ecosystem, that when one gets off, often through antibiotic overuse, but there's all sorts of ways that can get off for any given person, that the others, it's like a tripod. Like, as soon as you alter one of the legs, you're going to start to see imbalances. So it's, you will see people with multiple fungal infections, or in my particular case, I will have battling viral infections in my gut. And
your butt?
No, not my butt, my gut, my large intestine. They kind of, like, as soon as I work with one, then the other one shows up, and then I have to be really tight with protocols in order to get that balance to establish itself. Yeah.
Another anecdotal piece of that is, so when I added immunosuppression, in order to be on the drugs that I'm on, you test for TB, because the nature of the drug is that if you have latent tuberculosis, then the drug itself can
reactivate it,
right? Mm-hmm. And I had that. I had TB in my system.
Wow.
So the good news was my immune system was doing everything that it needed to wall it off, tuck it away, so that it wasn't affecting me. Mm-hmm. The drug could have taken that apart, so I was treated for the TB. Well, I made it through that treatment, and then the next thing, valley fever came up, and I had valley fever pneumonia.
Right.
So that it did. It took my system a long time to get balanced, but on the other side of that, then I did find a new balance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great
Okay.
example.
So much fun information about Diana.
It's a great way to get to know you better around a kitchen table.
But I like also knowing about the viruses in your gut.
Yes. Moving on.
Moving on. Okay, so the WHO. This is the piece that, in some ways gets the most attention. Because if you say, hey, immunocompromised people should not go out in public or should not participate in this event,
Mm-hmm.
then everything we've talked about helps understand why that statement might be made. But who does it apply to? Oh my goodness, it's still a very, very confusing arena.
Mm-hmm. And even inside of, and partly because this is so new, we want to have some generosity towards the health professionals that are trying to make recommendations, because we just didn't have a lot of information. But there's also, very wildly different philosophies within medicine as well. And so you can get very different answers from doctors if you're trying to approach them for, hey, I have this condition, what is your recommendation?
Right. And so let's jump into, we came up with 9 categories.
She's being super generous.
Hi, Helen.
Her brain came up with 9 categories, and she shared them with me, and now we'll share them with you. But before you go there.
But see, they were validated by her, which helps a lot. So we were going to go through them in one order, but I want to talk about category 8.
Okay,
right?
Which one is that?
Because category 8 is stress, exhaustion, malnutrition, improper nutrition, alcoholism, tobacco use, exposure to environmental toxins like pesticides or heavy metals, or over-consuming or under-consuming calories, lack of exercise.
Mm-hmm.
Like all of those significantly compromise the immune system.
They do.
And so you could have any one of the other categories but be doing really good in this category. And if we're talking about some magic threshold, how do you compare that person to the person who might not have chronic disease or autoimmune or blah, 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 and yet stress and exhaustion and malnutrition or poor nutrition and all of that means their immune system is crapped out.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not for the rest of their life, hopefully not,
Right.
because that's another thing, that the state of our immune system can be temporary. There are some conditions that are permanent, compromised conditions, but there's a lot that are temporary, and there's a lot we can do to make a difference.
Mm-hmm. And it's also, when we are in crisis, these are some of the easiest ways to go off balance.
Right.
And so this is also one of the ways in which we can have otherwise healthy people become incredibly vulnerable in a short period of time without them even really registering it. And that's somewhat problematic too. It also, I know I'm getting a little ahead of us, but this particular group, the malnutrition, the stress, the exhaustion, these are also some of the ones that become really tightly tied to what we might call comorbidities of heart disease, lung disease, all of these other things that then add another layer of sometimes even invisible, because so many people have those situations and don't know because they're not out exercising. So you don't know how compromised your lungs are. So it's these kind of silent ways in which we're vulnerable, and this is a total Aubrey interpretation here. In some ways, I could actually see this being a large part of why we see so many asymptomatic carriers.
Oh, interesting.
Right? Because there's a way in which their system is compromised, but not at a level that would lead to clinical symptoms, but they're still not able to fight it off completely. And, it gets to have this purchase that may not knock them out, but they're definitely working with it.
Yeah. Well,
I could go on about this one for forever, so we should move
no,
on.
well, but let's finish summarizing it. So the chronic diseases, that it's heart, lung, kidney, liver,
spleen.
Yeah, spleen ends up ending in a little bit different
that's
category. Because the spleen is specifically part of the immune
Diabetes.
system. Oh yeah, diabetes.
The big one that we had to.
Sickle cell anemia. These are all ones that are really interesting because they compromise many things. The immune system is compromised just by having chronic illness in any of these categories. And those diseases themselves take other kinds of tolls on body. They can take a toll on stress, right? Stress can add to them, but they can also create stress, right? So these two categories bounce back and forth in some really intense ways.
Right.
So those categories really do matter. Anyone with, and that's why that's what we hear. If you're immunocompromised, if you have heart disease, if you have diabetes, right? Like there's just a lot of pointing in those directions. There's one other piece that we've been having some conversation about, and this is not about a compromised immune system, but it's another way chronic disease, in particular diabetes, becomes an issue. And that is that any one of these situations can have a particular vulnerability with particular pathogens. So again, we talked about in the past that ankylosing spondylitis is more vulnerable to bacteria than to viruses.
Right.
Diabetes is especially vulnerable to coronavirus, this COVID-19, because COVID-19 enters the cell with the ACE2 receptors. That's how it gets in and does its destructive work. And ACE2 receptors are, the number of ACE2 receptors is amplified in diabetes, both type 1 and type 2. So that particular disease has a built-in additional vulnerability for COVID-19.
Yep. And that I know we're not going to get deep into this, but even some of the medications that are used to treat diabetes, but also heart disease that is often a complication with diabetes, can, even though it's an ACE inhibitor, so it's suppressing those sites, in a way it actually creates more of those sites in the body.
Yeah.
And so, this is one of those places where existing medical conditions and the ways that we're treating them can make us vulnerable in ways that are not immediately apparent.
Right.
Until we have enough data set to figure it out. And unfortunately, that means a lot of people need to get sick and possibly pass away.
And this is where getting geeky around the kitchen table, like, we love parsing all of this out, but when you hear about this in mainstream, you don't typically hear about, and this is why diabetes, it's not all of these pieces, it's diabetes is immunocompromised, so stay home.
Right. Yep. And I am a firm believer that the more you know about the mechanics of how your body works, the better you are able to align both behaviorally and then at the subconscious, conscious, unconscious levels. And
yeah,
in my mind, that makes for a healthier immune system overall.
Right.
Right?
Because body and mind working together.
Yes, ma'am.
All right, so we've gone 2 out of 9 categories.
We have.
And we are already at, I don't know how much time, it doesn't even say anymore.
It's been 20 minutes, 25 minutes.
There we go. So, I'm just going to start going through some of the other categories and you add some commentary. Sound good? So one of the categories is primary immunocompromised. That's a congenital disorder. You are born with the inability to make a certain antibody, as an example. Those are less common, but they're definitely a category. Another category is something that specifically represses the functionality of some aspect of the immune system, like you've had your spleen taken out. A third category that gets a lot of attention is we put both AIDS and cancer in here because they are the big honkin', there's a big immune system problem that's related to disease. I mean, all the other chronic diseases we've been talking about do suppress the immune system, but with AIDS and cancer, it's capital letter immune suppression. But even in both those cases, the story's more complex than it looks at first glance. So AIDS is acquired immune deficiency syndrome. Yeah, immune system's having trouble. But HIV, that's gotten good treatment, has someone who has good access to treatment, which unfortunately not everyone does. But if that happens, that's not an immune compromised condition.
Right.
Cancer, there's a whole bunch of conversations. Some will say that every type of cancer is immune compromised. Some will say different types of cancer and are like leukemia are, but not so much some others. And then some will say, no, the really big issue is the treatments, chemotherapy and radiation. It's all true.
Yeah. I think the simplest way that I think about it is that cancer proliferating in the body to the point where it becomes symptomatic is a failure of the immune system to do its job in the first place. Then there are cancers that specifically impact the immune system once they've taken hold and make for a whole other set of consequences. And then, the next piece is when you're treating it, especially with chemo and radiation, then you have all of these cascading, because they're biocides. They are meant to kill things. So you then have all of these other consequences on top of the immune system not having functioned well in the first place. So all of those are valid. And
they just mean all these different things.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's easy to lose track of where you're at inside of all of it too.
Right.
Especially since cancer is typically a pretty emotional process to begin with. So that higher level decision-making functioning can go right out the window.
Yeah, and I just want to go back to that category that has stress in it, because we talk about stress, but emotional well-being and balance doesn't end up getting emphasized enough as its own category, and it absolutely should be.
Yeah.
Our emotional health. Yeah.
For sure.
Okay, congenital disorders, immune system organs in trouble, AIDS and cancer. Our fourth category was autoimmune, RA, AS, lupus, MS, psoriatic arthritis, type 1 diabetes. In all of these cases, in some ways, the immune system is over-responding. There's an upregulating. But in that dysfunction and also in the presence of that much inflammation, there's lots of ways that the system gets compromised.
Absolutely. Yeah. And leaves big open doors for more things to come in.
Yes. And then there's all the medications that go with those kinds of things. And then the medications themselves, whether it's the one I'm on or methotrexate or steroids. Another example of this is medications for transplant.
Yep. And those are things that are typically intentionally keeping the immune system from overreacting, because like in a transplant, you have something in your body you don't want it to reject. But also there's a lot of medications out there where immunosuppression is a side effect.
Yeah.
And again, if you're not super aware that that's what's going on, or until you really get to know how that drug interacts with your system, you really have no idea
that's
how
right.
it's impacting you. So any new big health event is gonna, you kind of just have to hold it with kid gloves and have a lot more space around it, because you don't know what the impact is going to be yet.
Right. And which reminds me that what didn't actually end up on this list. Hi, CJ, welcome. We're talking about who is immunocompromised and why, and what didn't end up on this list is things that happen through accidents. So it's not just the state of your body or your behavior, but both the trauma of accidents and the specific damage caused by accidents. Extensive burns are a classic example.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. Or even, a car accident where you've had whiplash and your entire nervous system is still in the process of calibrating in a way, you really don't have a fully functional immune system for up to weeks in some cases.
Yeah. For future, I'm writing that down as its own separate thing. Let's see. We talked about that one. I think it's just these two we haven't talked about. So we talked about chronic diseases, but then there's also temporary diseases that once your body's already dealing with them, TB being an example, Epstein-Barr is an example, chickenpox, herpes, that when when your body is processing that kind of thing, you are compromised in your ability to process other things.
Absolutely. Yeah. Another example of the doors just being wide open and your forces being, in that case, when you are actively at war, there is a sense of if you're at war, you're already overextended. So the ability for something to sneak in through the back door is just that much more prevalent.
And then the final category is just things about the human condition. Pregnancy is a moment when we're immunocompromised, because the body's smart enough to tone the whole thing down so that this foreign invader can actually live and thrive for 9 months.
Right.
And aging. Now, sometimes when we're talking about immunocompromised, we're also talking about babies, because it's a system not yet developed and being developed through nursing. We talk about that less right now with COVID-19 because for whatever reason, that one's not hitting so much there. In aging, as we all age though, our ability to produce things like the complement proteins that are needed in the immune system goes down.
Right.
Now, go ahead.
Oh, and I was going to say, there are also periods of time in life, like with major hormone changes, whether it's sex hormones or even metabolic hormones, because your life has changed drastically in one way or another. Each of those periods of time, the entire way that your body functions is shifting so dramatically that, again, it's unknown territory.
Yeah.
And you just have to accommodate and anticipate that there's going to be a difference.
Yeah. So one of the comments that I read about aging, so on the one hand, we see it in the mortality rates related to aging and COVID-19, that it really is true. There are consequences to the way the immune system slows down.
Hi, Deb. Welcome.
Hi there. But the idea of this is my list of takeaways. I didn't tell you that I'd written some of those.
You hid them. I like it. Surprise me on camera.
And one of them is, yes, we need to be thinking about our immune system and what its current state is right now, and how does that inform any decisions we're making during a pandemic. But also it's an opportunity to up our game on learning about our immune system and taking care of it, because by taking care of it now, it actually determines how well we age.
Absolutely.
The immune system is a driver for how well we age. And if we're not aging well, that then is an indicator that the immune system itself is starting to break down.
That's such a great way to put that. Really good point. Yeah.
What other takeaways do you think about?
Oh boy. Well, I think what I've been really talking about with you and with some of the other people that we chat with is, to the extent that we don't know ourselves, we have to rely on other people's recommendations, right? We can't just take a study that's occurred and then apply it to our own experience, because if we don't know what our own experience is, we don't have a place to put it. And it makes us dependent in a way that I personally don't think is all that healthy.
Which is why we talk about these things around the kitchen table.
And then another piece is, even just like, I actually hadn't gone through and really understood how many different categories there are of being immunocompromised, even though I work with plenty of people that are. And it just highlights how different each person's best practices are going to be. Right. And I've been really experimenting this week a lot with this idea of like, hey, we're so polarized right now that we've forgotten that there's a middle path. And what I've really discovered for myself is that there's probably this middle channel, this groove that's about this big, and I might occupy a tiny little space within it, but it doesn't mean that what's on either side of me is wrong.
Right.
And but the truth is I think in this conversation, what I realized is you and I couldn't have a realistic conversation about this is where I stand and this is what I know I need. This is where you stand and this is what you know you need, without this bigger awareness of how complex the system is, and then of how different each individual is going to be.
That's right. And it's so important to keep us out of the us and them. Because when we look at this, the more we look at this, the more we are all immunocompromised in some moments, in some ways, on some days.
Mm-hmm.
And some of us experience it to a level that then there's an identification with the label. And that can become helpful because of what it spurs in terms of awareness and learning and response. And it can become its own problem because it then creates this weird, like, oh, you people are the weak ones.
Right.
And we are much more interconnected. This is all of our story. And the more we know that, the more we know how different we are, that we get to make different decisions, but that those decisions have this connectivity with each other and everyone out there. Maybe we get past some of the polarizing.
That would be great. I would also love to see this become a place where, rather than becoming so concerned about, oh my God, what is the next thing that could attack me, which is fundamentally a victim position. It's walking around waiting for someone to jump out and grab you on the street at all times.
That's right.
And really, I don't hear a lot of it in the mainstream press about what does it mean to have a healthy immune system? What are best practices? Like, we don't hear that. But I'm hoping that the general population, inside of all of these conflicting information pieces, might wake up to, oh, hey, not only might there be a large middle ground that is not being acknowledged, but maybe I should start getting curious about actually applying some of this stuff to my own life and then discovering our own way forward. So we're not as susceptible to the next thing that comes about, because we're going to have a next thing.
Right. And how do we get smart enough now?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you guys for being so patient with us and joining us today around the kitchen table.
And
I think you got to do it today.
It's too big.
It is too big. There's no fitting that in my mask.
So we'll just celebrate an apple a day.
There you go.
See y'all next time.